Welcome to the Christian Theologist channel, where reason and sound exegesis are used to highlight faulty doctrine and practice in the contemporary English-speaking church. The title of this video is, You Are Not the Good Samaritan. In this video, I'm going to be looking at a significant issue regarding the typical interpretation of the so-called parable of the Good Samaritan, the famous story that Jesus tells just before, or just after, he reaches Jerusalem in the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel, between verses 25 and 37 inclusive.
The parable of the Good Samaritan is largely misunderstood. People are familiar with the story, but not so familiar with the point of the story.
I'm sure many of us are familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. In fact, we've even taken that phrase and incorporated it into our language. Anybody who does a good deed for somebody is called a Good Samaritan. But I'm willing to wager that most of us don't really know the point of the parable of the Good Samaritan.
We're going to do a quick breakdown of the parable of the Good Samaritan so that we can ask ourselves, what is Jesus trying to say to us in this parable?
Here's the passage from the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. While there are many interesting questions one can ask about the parable of the Good Samaritan, of crucial importance is the question, which character in the parable are we supposed to identify with?
So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how am I like any one of the people in this parable?
The reason it's important to determine which character to identify with is because, as with any multiple character story that's made to teach you a lesson, you won't understand that lesson properly if you see it from the wrong character's point of view.
When have I been, unfortunately, like the priest or the Levite who chooses to be either pure or holy or better than someone who is in great need? When have I been like the Samaritan who goes out and helps someone who is hurting in some way, either emotionally or physically? Or when have I been like the victim in need of help, feeling helpless, in need of some kind of a good person, a Samaritan, to step over and help us when we're in need?
Imagine if you read Jack and the Beanstalk and you immediately related to the giant's point of view instead of Jack's. That is, if instead of seeing the giant as a horrible monster hoarding his stolen riches, you saw him as a relatable, innocent loner being robbed of his money, his golden egg-laying goose, and his magical self-playing harp. What lesson would you learn by taking that perspective? Well, you might draw several lessons interpreting the story with that point of view, but you most definitely wouldn't have learned the lessons that the author intended to teach, which the author of this post says is taking advantage of the opportunities that life provides you, and fortune favors the bold. And if you miss those lessons for that reason, well, that would be a monumental failure of storytelling on the author's part. Because any halfway decent storyteller will easily prevent having his audience relate to the wrong character, and then learning the wrong lesson by simply doing two things. One, he makes his story about the character whose point of view he wants his intended audience to relate to, the character through whom he'll teach his lesson. In other words, he makes this particular character the subject of his story. The second thing he'll do is make this subject character the easiest character for his audience to relate to. And this is exactly what the author of Jack and the Beanstalk did. Notice how the story starts by introducing Jack, a poor boy living with his mother, who, significantly, is not named, which also helps to make her more of a secondary character in relation to Jack. So from this first sentence, the audience is clear that this story is about Jack, that Jack is the subject character of this story. As for Jack being the most relatable character, well, he's a boy and, except for his mother, all the other characters are mythological creatures. So, since this is a story written to teach and amuse human children, it's safe to say that the intended audience for the lesson would more easily relate to Jack. Simply put, an audience will relate more naturally to characters like themselves. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Okay, first question. Who is the subject of this story? Answer: the man is the subject of this story. No marks if you said the robbers. So, just like the subject of Jack and the Beanstalk, the subject of the parable is the introductory character. And just like the author of Jack and the Beanstalk, this character will turn out to be the most relatable to his intended audience. That's because the intended audience for the parable are the disciples and the ever-growing crowd of Jewish onlookers that follow Jesus as he makes his way to Jerusalem. Neither the disciples nor the vast majority of the crowd would have been priests, Levites, or, most especially, Samaritans. There wouldn't have been that many robbers either. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Okay, second question. Is the priest or the Levite now the subject of the story? Answer: no. They each made too brief an appearance to displace the man as the subject. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Okay, third and final question. Is the Samaritan now the subject of the story? If you answered yes, you're not alone. The majority of interpreters teach that we should identify with the Samaritan, that he becomes the subject of the parable. This is because they believe that the lesson of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that we are to be just like the Samaritan and be the loving neighbor to anyone we find in need of help.
So ask yourself, have I been given the opportunity to be a neighbor, to be like the Samaritan in this story? And have I accepted that opportunity, or have I turned it down and looked away?
He said, suppose the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, and you go and do the same. You go and do the same for everybody. Because everybody, even the Samaritan who you can't stand, is your neighbor. And you love that person just as much as you love the people who are like you. That's the point of the Good Samaritan. We're to love everybody.
Jesus says in verse 36, this isn't about who your neighbor is. This is about, are you a neighbor? It's not who is my neighbor, who qualifies to be loved, but it's about, am I a neighbor who loves in an unqualified way? Deeply, the point comes to the heart. Forget trying to decide who qualifies for you to love them, and demonstrate love that knows no qualifications. Everyone in your path, everyone in your path, everyone in your path all the time with a need is to be loved lavishly, loved sacrificially, loved generously, loved tenderly, loved limitlessly, loved kindly, loved as long as the need exists.
And again, this particular lesson can only be drawn from the parable if you're identifying with the Samaritan, if you're adopting his point of view of the events, if you believe the author has replaced the original subject, the victim, with the Samaritan. Let's see if the author agrees with this idea of him having switched subjects. Here's the parable in the original Greek, that is, in the language and wording of the story when it was first written, copied and recopied, and passed around to be read in the first Christian churches. I've divided it here into the same 6 paragraphs as the English version we just read. And don't worry, you don't have to read Greek to understand what I'm about to show you. The first word in the Greek parable is the subject character, a man, the eventual victim of the robbers, highlighted here in yellow. These 3 words are the Greek words him. The one at the bottom is in green, because it's not in every single Greek manuscript that we have, but it is in many significant ones. Here are the second 3 paragraphs of the Greek text, with the rest of the words for him and his in yellow. That second green one appears in even more manuscripts than the first one does. Now here's a view of the whole parable, with the word man and all the hims and hises highlighted. Notice that they are distributed throughout the parable. Notice too that there are no blue ones. Here's the English translation again. This time, the words in blue are all the forms of he, him, and his that the translators had to add in order to produce clear, grammatically correct sentences in English, words the Greek language can do without. Now, notice that out of the 10 blue ones that occur after the first paragraph, only 1 refers to the man. All the others refer to either the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan. This means that after we delete all of the blue ones, every single yellow and green one left refers back to the first word in the parable, that is the man, the subject of the story, just like the original Greek text. Just listen to how the parable sounds when read this way. Listen to how every time the word he, him, or his is mentioned, it only refers to the man, the original subject of the story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat and departed, leaving half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when saw him, passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as journeyed, came to where he was, and when saw him, had compassion, went to and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then set him on own animal, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. It seems clear to me that this is a literary device the author was using to keep his reader's eyes and audience's ears focused on the victim. The victim is the only character the author ever refers to in the third person, as he, him, or his, and in this way he maintains him as the subject character throughout the parable. And again, he does this because the important lesson he wants to teach his intended audience can only be learned by adopting the point of view of the victim. That is, just like all of his other narrative parables, the lesson Jesus is teaching with the parable of the Good Samaritan can only be properly understood when, instead of seeing yourself as the hero of the story, in this case the Samaritan, you see yourself as the humiliated zero of the story, that is, the victim, the man who was beaten, stripped, left for dead, and badly in need of the mercy of another, a neighbor, who he is now obligated to love for showing him mercy, just like we are obligated to love God for showing us mercy. In the traditional interpretation of the Samaritan parable, this crucial identification with the humblest character has been erased, and, not surprisingly, the wrong lesson has been learned.
Thanks for watching, and before you go, don't forget to hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and bell notification buttons. God bless.